Wheat from Jefferson Community and Technical College.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today to talk a little bit about how we can teach some of these visual literacy skills to students using the tools that are in Blackboard Collaborate. So today I want to first start by talking a little bit about what is visual literacy, why is it important, and is this a skill that we can actually teach? But then I want to quickly get into talking about what are some of the visual conventions or the commonly used tools that textbook publishers use, and how can we help students understand and use those tools for comprehension? And then what are the tools that are in Blackboard Collaborate that can help students? What are some specific activities that we can use so that students can start to better comprehend and understand the images that we use in teaching and learning? And so some of this information was originally presented to me in a pamphlet that I got from Pearson Publishing, written by Lori Garrett, called The Art of Teaching A&P. My background is that I teach biology, anatomy and physiology for nursing and allied health students, as well as general biology for non-majors. And then after reading that pamphlet, I participated in a book circle at my college, reading the book, Reading for Understanding, on reading apprenticeship. And both of these talked a lot about the importance of visual literacy as a tool that we can give to our students to help them with their comprehension. So visual literacy is a skill and it can be taught. Lori Garrett gets her definition: the ability to understand and use images, including the ability to learn, from this Braden and Horton reference. And so when I started to look at the ways that people teach visual literacy to students, I found this research study where they created a workbook that walked students through some of these conventions that publishers use and ways that they can understand figures. And when they implemented students' work with this workbook, with even just modest fidelity, even not even full implementation, but they found a statistically significant better student gain in comprehension of those biology diagrams. So it is a skill, and we can teach this skill to students. So what are some of these common artwork conventions? Publishers tend to spend quite a bit of time and effort and money in the way that they design the artwork. And so they very specifically design some with things like arrows showing a transition from one thing to another, or the passage of time, those kinds of things. Color is another commonly used artwork convention. Information can be presented on a coordinate plane, so with an X and Y axis. Publishers can sometimes use charts and tables to convey information to students. And then sometimes things can be shown as a sequence of events or even a cycle in a circular pattern to show a repeating cycle. And then, of course, we can also try to set up visual conventions to show students the passage of time. So in my online classes, one of the things that I started to do asynchronously was create a video and a PowerPoint to point out to students how these conventions are actually used by their textbook publisher. And so first I started to talk about the fact that information in a figure can be color-coded. And some of these color conventions persist throughout several figures. So anytime DNA is represented in their book, these same color codings will be used. Now, I recorded this as a video and gave the students the PowerPoint, so there's a lot of words on this slide for them to use. But then we went on to talk about examples of how information can be presented in a coordinate plane. So having students look at this, that there's an x-axis and a y-axis. This also uses color, and also there are some arrows. And then I gave them an example of how information can be presented in a cycle, as a sequence of events that happens over and over again in a cyclical way. And so these are some examples that I can give to students for how the textbook publisher is trying to teach them information, trying to convey information using some of these really common conventions. And just by pointing out some of these conventions, it starts to give students some skills for tackling some of these figures. But then what are some of the tools that we can use that are in Blackboard Collaborate? So I want to go ahead and give you some examples of activities that you can use with your students in a synchronous online session. So live class sessions give you the opportunity to use some of the tools embedded in Blackboard Collaborate to engage students both with you and with one another in facing some of these challenges of deciphering the figures from the text. We know that collaborative learning activities help with comprehension and retention of course content. And so giving students the ability to work together, even in fully online classes, will help strengthen their ability to decode and understand some of these figures. So how can we do that in synchronous sessions? Well, one of the easiest or more simple activities is to just ask students, what do you see? And so I've done this in live class sessions where I've asked students just to drop in the chat, what is this figure about? And sometimes you have to inject a bit of humor, especially if there's a title there. Students will actually kind of overthink it and get confused. They'll be a little suspicious because they'll be thinking it can't be that easy, right? There's a title right there that says what the figure's about. And now she's asking me what this figure is about. And so I'd tell them that, yes, it actually can be that easy. This teaches them that they can find answers in the text or in the figure itself. The figure actually has information in it that it's trying to convey to them, and you can look to that figure to try to get the information. And so, exactly, it's not a trick question at all. It really is us trying to show students to start to seek as much information in that figure as they can get. This is a figure that is in a textbook that I teach from that's really, really complicated. And there are a lot of arrows. So remember that I mentioned one of the things that I tell students is to look at the arrows. So this is actually a screen recording. I'm going to press play so that you can see. I just ask students to circle the arrows. And with a little bit of prompting, I reminded them that there are some colored arrows and not just black and white arrows. And so in this synchronous session, I told students how to use the annotation tools and that they could get a pen or they could get a shape and just to circle the arrows that they see. There's a lot of arrows in this figure. And students even then began doing their own annotations by drawing in some of their own arrows. But just by circling the arrows, by calling attention to the various ways arrows are used in this figure, I could start to then explain and give context about what this figure was actually trying to show. And then I added in an arrow for my own annotation that I then used as a pointer to try to point out what was happening in this figure to students. That this is actually two kind of cycles. That the top is actually when something goes up, things happen to bring it back down. And when something goes down, things happen to bring it back up. So this is a way that in a live class session, both students and I used some of the annotation tools to mark up this slide, to mark up this figure, and really start to drill down into what is it trying to show you? What are all these arrows and what do they mean? Another way that I've used the annotation tools with students in a live class session is to put up a figure that needs some labeling and to ask students to grab a text box and start to fill in some of the labels. So this is a screenshot from a Blackboard Collaborate session that I did not too long ago. And I gave students some instruction in the beginning for how to use some of the annotation tools. For this, primarily, they used the text box and put a text box on each of these leader lines to fill in the names of the muscles. And I had a group of students, and they worked together on this to fill in all of the labels. And then again, I made an arrow to point out some of the additional muscles that we were discussing that weren't labeled in this figure. This is a figure that's from the lab manual that I use for teaching the class. And so I just snipped it out of the book and put it into a slide and did share files. And since students had permissions to use the annotation tools, then they were able to fill in with some of the labels on the figure. In order for students to be able to do either of these activities, you'll need to make sure and set the permissions for them to be able to use the annotation tools. And so when you click on your settings wheel and you go to session settings at the bottom, usually these are on by default. And you would just need to make sure that draw on whiteboard and files is selected for your participants. And then the students will have all of those annotation tools. They will have the pen and the brush, the text box, the ability to do some shapes, which we'll talk about a way to use the shapes here in just a minute. But if you set the permissions, then students will be able to access those annotation tools, and you can start to make the interactions around the figures a little bit more interactive. Another thing that I do that I call leading questions is to create a worksheet with a figure that I want students to look at a little more closely. And along with that figure, I've created some questions. And so I put students in breakout rooms and send the document to their breakout rooms. I'll drop in and help facilitate the conversation. But the conversation really is going to be framed around the worksheet that already contains the questions. I drop some time cues in the chat and then bring everybody back for some debriefing and some further discussion. So here is an example of a graph. And so looking at this top graph, I ask students, what is this a graph of? Again, to get them to just look at the labels that are already here, to look at what's in the figure, what the figure's already telling them. And then one question, what is the optimal temperature of this typical human enzyme? And so they can find a number. And then what's the optimal temperature for this heat tolerant bacteria enzyme? And then a discussion question, why are they different? And so once students have had a chance to talk together, looking very closely at this figure, we can then move on and talk about the bottom figure. And they realize that the skills that they picked up from looking at this top figure translate to looking at the bottom figure as well. They look at the axes, they look at the labels, and they realize that they can take skills that they've used in one context and really start to apply it to another figure in a similar context. And that's really helpful to teach students that they are learning and developing skills, and this is a skill set that they can develop. It's not something that they either know how to do or don't know how to do, but it's something that they can learn and develop. It's part of that growth mindset piece. Now, what about when our figures are really complicated? This is a figure that I use when I'm teaching anatomy and physiology too. This is about blood cell development. There's a lot happening here. I designed an entire 1-hour synchronous session just around this one figure, because this is the kind of figure that students are likely to skip over. It looks tough. There's a lot going on, and it looks like it's going to be hard work. And so it's just easier to skip over it. So what I did was I started with a 3-minute silent reading of this figure. And in a live online class, it feels really weird for things to get silent, for people to read. It's weird to go into an online session and for it to be quiet. So I told students ahead of time, go back into Blackboard, go into this week's reading, find this figure, and we're going to take about 3 minutes to really kind of take a look at it. In case you didn't have a chance to look at it before, now is a chance for you to actually start to take a look. And then we started to talk about, what do the arrows mean? So at the top, these large gray arrows are actually showing magnification. And so once we talk, usually that's pretty easy for students to see that this is getting blown up into this, which is getting blown up into this. But then there's a lot of other arrows in this figure, and they're actually color coded. So there's a set of red arrows, there's a set of magenta arrows, there's a whole set of purple arrows, there's a set of blue arrows. And so then I put students into groups and assigned each group a color or a set of these arrows to examine. Now, ahead of time, I had set up a PowerPoint presentation. We're a Microsoft institution, so we use OneDrive. So I shared a link to a PowerPoint that I had set up in OneDrive. And so each group was given one slide and the question, what do your color arrows mean? And so with a title, but with the rest of the slide blank, I then sent the students into their breakout rooms, and room 1 was going to talk about the red arrows, and room 2 was going to talk about the magenta arrows, and room 3 was going to talk about the purple arrows, etc. And so I can keep an eye on this PowerPoint and watch as students start to summarize their discussion by writing into the PowerPoint slide a summary of what it is that they're discussing. I did, when I did this particular exercise, there was one group that hadn't started their slide yet, so I could drop into that breakout room, kind of start to ask them what they'd been discussing, and did they want to go ahead and start filling in their PowerPoint slide. And then you can bring everyone back from the breakout rooms, and everyone's looking through that PowerPoint file to see the summary of all of the groups and what they discussed. And so once we do some debriefing, this is what group 1 talked about. This is what group 2 talked about. This is what group 3 talked about. Group 3's summary was more general. It could apply to all of the arrows, not just the purple ones. So then we got into a little bit more discussion about what specifically the differences were. And then at the very end, I asked students an agree, disagree question. At the bottom of Blackboard Collaborate, if they click on their avatar or their picture, you can get an agree or disagree button. And I ask students to agree or disagree at the end of this whole hour-long class, at the end of this entire discussion. Did they feel like they understood this figure to a better degree. And all of the students who were in the class clicked agree that they understood the figure better after working with it for almost an entire hour in a class. Now, they probably were telling me that a little bit because they knew that's what I wanted to hear. But a lot of the times my students are very honest with me. And so I got some feedback in email from a student also that she thought it was helpful that we just took this one figure and dove in to such a significant degree. Another way that you can use the Collaborate annotation tools is to put up a blank whiteboard and do some mind mapping. Along with the lab manual that I teach out of, at the end of each lab, there's a blank, sort of blank with some filled in, mind map that students can use. It gives them the terms that they'll need to put in. And so this gives students a framework for starting to do a mind map or a concept map where they're relating different terms and concepts that we're studying. But you can also have students create their own mind map. So this is a quick screen recording of some students working together to put together a mind map using some of the annotation tools that are in Share a Blank Whiteboard. Now, I've edited this significantly. It does not happen this fast in real life. This was actually about an 8-minute exercise where students were just working. But I wanted to edit it down so that you can see if your students aren't quite familiar enough with the annotation controls to be able to do the shapes and the connectors themselves, you can go into your Blackboard Collaborate and practice and set up a framework where students would then only need to use a text box and fill in different terms. Or once they get more comfortable using the annotation tools, you could even put them in a breakout room and have them build their own mind map that they can bring back and show to the rest of the class. So there's a lot of different ways that you can implement using the blank whiteboard to create a concept map or a mind map of the terms and concepts that you're teaching. So how do we help students who are really intimidated by the images that they see? A lot of these images are really complicated. I've shown you some of the really complicated ones in the textbook that I teach from. One of the techniques that I want to show you is something called a think aloud. And both Lori Garrett and the Reading Apprenticeship book talk about a think aloud as an activity to do with students to really help make explicit the thought processes that we have when we look at a figure. And so last fall, my students in my general biology class had a lot of questions about COVID and the coronavirus, and we had been talking about viruses. And so I was going to do a live synchronous session where we talked about hand washing because they'd asked, is hand washing really that big of a deal? And I wanted to talk about soap and how soap affects virus structure. And I came across this figure. And when I first looked at this figure, I wasn't even sure what it was trying to show. It took me a minute. I had to use some of my visual literacy skills to figure this out. And so I decided that I would use it with students as an example of a think aloud to show my thinking. And so here's what I do with students. I say out loud the thought processes I had when I first looked at this figure. So a lot of times we look at a figure from left to right or top to bottom. So I can see that there's some labels. They're talking about the head and the tail parts of these are the red and blue are soap molecules. But there's also a virus molecule. Here's a line, and this says skin. Is this supposed to be under the surface of the skin? And then as it goes over to the right-hand side, now this is back up at the top. Okay, so I think what they're trying to show is that you actually want to go left, go down, and then up, because here's the intact virus. I think this is supposed to be on the surface of the skin, not under the surface of the skin. Okay, so this intact virus, the soap molecules begin to disrupt it, then it disintegrates, and here the soap is trapping the bits of the virus particle. Okay, now I have this figure kind of figured out. Okay, and so when you do that, when you do a think aloud with students, it helps them to see some of the analysis that you go through when you're trying to figure out what a figure is trying to show you. You can do this as a teacher demonstrated think aloud, and then you can have students take turns in their breakout rooms. Ask students to begin to think out loud with one another in a partner format. It can feel really risky, but once they realize that other people are just as confused as they are, other people have to go through the same steps to figure something out. Not everybody looks at something and understands it right away. And then whether you do it teacher demonstrated or peer demonstrated, ask them specifically, what did you notice? Right? So what behaviors did you see people using to try to figure out how to decode the figures? You can begin with students to make a list of metacognitive strategies to really help them understand what it is that they're looking at. West Ed has a number of reading apprenticeship sources. This visual literacy is just a piece of a whole reading type of activity that I'm trying to implement in some of my live online classes. So here's a link to some of the resources that I use with students. Here's some fix-up steps you can give them. And then also they have like a metacognitive bookmark. So you can think about other kind of metacognitive strategies to help students with reading and visual literacy. And then in this PowerPoint also is a link to a few resources, and that includes the preface to The Art of Teaching A&P by Lori Garrett, where she talks more about teaching visual literacy skills, and the fix-up steps and the metacognitive bookmarks from the Reading Apprenticeship website are in there as well. Then I'm always happy to take questions as you start to implement any of these activities. So you're welcome to reach me by email. And I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has. So, Christina, I like your comment about developing critical thinking skills. We know that student-student interaction is really, really important. And so having the students to be able to collaborate together to talk about how they're looking at these figures, I think really develops a whole level of awareness of how to analyze some of these figures when they're first looking at them. And sometimes you can look around and you think, well, everybody just looked at that and figured it out. And you don't realize until we start to say out loud our thought processes that it took people a minute. And if people would share some of that confusion and how they clear up that to get to understanding, I think that that helps students realize that these are behaviors that we implement, these are steps that we do, and it's not just something that happens to us. It is hard to let students be interactive in the sessions because there's a lot of dead air, there's a little bit of lag time, especially when you invite students to start to do something and nobody wants to be the one to go first. But the more that you can allow students to be involved and a part of that, the more engaging they're going to find those, and the more they're going to take away from those sessions. So it definitely is challenging. Especially when we got the new whiteboard controls, I just threw a whiteboard up and let students play. And I let them do that for almost 10 minutes because it takes a little while to learn some of the newer controls. I like that the whiteboard persists, and I love the improvements to it, but it takes students a few minutes to get comfortable with those controls. Yes, the concepts can apply to a lot of different platforms that people use, whether it's in Zoom, because Zoom does annotations and things like that now too. So a lot of these are not just dependent on Blackboard Collaborate, but there's a lot of good things that you can use, a lot of tools that are in Collaborate that you can use with students. So Corey, if you want to get in touch with me by email, we can make sure that that you get a recording, and I recorded a rehearsal of this also. So if you are really unable to get a clean audio copy, then we can try to make sure that that's available. So yes, I agree. The new improvements to the whiteboard are really really important, and they really improve the way that we can use either annotating slides or using a blank whiteboard with students. I was really pleased to see a lot of the improvements and the upgrades to that, because it really makes it a more effective tool with using with students. I can. Okay, any other questions that anyone has? Thank you guys so much for being here. This was a good conversation. This is one of the things that I really wanted to try with students, and something that I have found that's been pretty successful. And students seem to really enjoy the learning, like realizing that this is something that they can develop as a skill, that it's not just something that that they either have or they don't have. It's not something that has to happen to them. It's something that they can work on and develop. So talking about using whiteboard, I do have a Wacom pen pad, and I have been able to use my pen pad in doing some of my own drawings. Obviously, our students don't all have that kind of technology accessible. So students are usually using the mouse. So that's why I really like the text box, because they can put a text box and they can type, and they're not having to try to write with their mouse. And then they can use an arrow, so they don't have to try to draw an arrow with their mouse. They can actually just draw. They can select the arrow tool, draw an arrow, and move it around. They can select a circle and move that around to circle something. Although when I did the activity with my students, a lot of them did just make a circle with their mouse. So they would click on the pen and use their mouse to draw a circle, or they could click on the circle tool to draw out a circle and move it around and use it. But I have used a pen pad and am able to do some pretty decent drawing myself with my pen pad. But then the tools are also available for students to use, and they can use it without having to have any kind of a pen pad. Thank you guys so much for being here. Have a really good rest of the day at the Digital Teaching Symposium.